Hey everyone! When people talk about violent arcade games, the first ones that come to mind are usually Mortal Kombat or House of the Dead. But the truth is, the arcades of the 80s and 90s were littered with forgotten gems that were just as violent, if not more brutal, than the household names. Some of these titles went under the radar because they were too shocking, too niche, or simply overshadowed by bigger franchises. Today, we're diving into 20 brutal, often forgotten arcade gems. We'll talk about what they are, what made them controversial, their strengths and flaws, and whether they deserve more love from retro gamers. Buckle up! It's going to be a grisly, nostalgic ride. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. Guerrilla War. The first game I want to talk about is Guerrilla War, which came out in 1987 from SNK. Now, if you grew up with Metal Slug, this is like its scrappy older cousin who never got quite the same fame. What made Guerrilla War interesting right from the start is that it wasn't shy about its politics. In the Japanese version, the playable characters were literally Che Guevara and Fidel Castro, storming a fictional island to overthrow a dictator. By the time it made it to the West, SNK quietly scrubbed those names, but the theme of violent revolution was still baked in. Playing it in the arcade was pure chaos. You had a rotating joystick so you could move one way and shoot in another, which gave you the sense of constant action in all directions. Enemies swarmed you relentlessly, tanks rolled in, hostages were caught in the crossfire, and if you weren't careful, you could kill the very civilians you were supposed to save. That accidental friendly fire gave the violence a little extra sting because it felt personal. I always felt Guerrilla War deserved more recognition because of its frantic pacing and sheer difficulty. It wasn't just run and gun, it was survive, adapt, and hope you didn't blow up a hostage in the process. Chiller. If Guerrilla War was chaotic, Chiller was downright disturbing. This arcade shooter from Exidy came out in 1986, and honestly, it's one of the strangest games I've ever played. Instead of fighting enemy soldiers or aliens, you're literally torturing people in medieval horror chambers. You had victims strapped to racks, locked in Iron Maidens, tied up waiting to be shredded, and you just shot at them. Pieces of bodies flew off. Limbs got blasted away, and all of this was happening in a pixelated arcade cabinet. The violence wasn't cartoonish, it was intentionally grotesque. No surprise, a lot of arcade operators refused to stock it. That's partly why Chiller became more of a myth than a mainstream hit. Later, it even got an unlicensed NES port where you could use the zapper, but that version toned things down and replaced some humans with monsters. Even censored, it felt wrong, which I think was the point. Chiller might not be a great game mechanically, the levels repeat quickly, and the gameplay is shallow, but as a piece of shocking arcade history, it's unforgettable. Narc. By 1988, Williams Electronics decided to go all in on the war on drugs, and that's how we got Narc. I have to say, this game is wild. You play as Max Force or Hitman, two narcotics officers armed to the teeth, and your mission is to take down every drug dealer, gang member, and criminal boss in sight. On paper, it sounds like a simple beat-em-up shooter, but in practice, it's one of the earliest games to go heavy on gore. I still remember the first time I fired a rocket at a group of enemies and watched them explode into bloody chunks. That was unheard of in 1988. What's funny is that Narc was meant to be a kind of moral lesson, showing the dangers of drugs and the need for law enforcement. But the irony is that players loved it precisely because it was so gleefully violent. It spawned ports for the NES and even a modern remake in 2005, but none of those versions captured the raw chaos of the arcade original. To me, Narc stands as one of those rare games that was both a public service announcement and an excuse to blow bad guys to bits. Atomic Runner Chelnov. Now let's talk about a game that feels like it was ripped straight out of a Cold War nightmare. Atomic Runner Chelnov. This one was made by Data East in 1988, and the premise alone is enough to make you pause. You play as Chelnov, a nuclear plant worker who barely survives a catastrophic explosion. Instead of dying, though, the radiation mutates him into a superpowered fighter who now has to take on waves of monsters, robots, and mutated freaks. It's the kind of game that makes you wonder whether the developers were working through some real anxieties about nuclear energy in the 80s. What I always liked about Chelnov is how fast and relentless it feels. The game auto-scrolls, so you don't get to stop and breathe. You're constantly sprinting forward, punching, kicking and blasting away at whatever jumps onto the screen. The violence isn't gore in the same way Chiller was, but there's something disturbing about how the enemies look. A lot of them are half human, half mechanical, like Frankenstein's monsters reimagined through a nuclear lens. When you kill them, they crumple in unsettling ways, adding to the eerie atmosphere. The Genesis version is probably the best way to play at home, though the arcade original had a grittier, sharper edge. Beastbusters. By 1989, SNK decided to get in on the horror action with Beastbusters, and man, this game is pure zombie shooting chaos. Imagine you and a couple of friends walking into a crumbling city overrun by the undead, and instead of running for your lives, you each pick up a massive gun and just unload round after round. That's exactly what Beastbusters is. The cabinet itself was awesome. It came with mounted machine guns that rattled when you fired, making the experience feel immersive and loud. The enemies came in waves, sometimes sprinting zombies, sometimes grotesque mutants, and the further you went, the grosser it got. Heads flew, limbs popped, and blood sprayed across the screen. What I really admire about Beastbusters is how unapologetic it is. There's no slow build, no suspense like Resident Evil would later perfect. From the very first level, you're drowning in corpses, and the only option is to keep firing. It was 3-player too, which meant the arcade cabinet always drew a crowd. Looking back, it's clear why it got overshadowed. SNK just had bigger hits like Metal Slug down the line. Line of Fire. The next one on my list is Line of Fire, released by Sega in 1989. This game feels like an action movie that never lets up. You play as a commando escaping enemy territory after stealing a powerful new weapon, and the entire thing is basically one long gauntlet of explosions, helicopters, tanks, and troops coming after you. What's cool about Line of Fire is that it mixes perspectives. Sometimes you're looking down the sights in a first-person rail shooter sequence, blasting enemies as they come toward you, and other times you're behind the commando, mowing down enemies while sprinting or riding a vehicle. That switching of viewpoints gave the game a cinematic quality that felt way ahead of its time in the late 80s. And let's be real, this game is violent. It isn't gore in the sense of flesh and blood spraying everywhere, but the sheer body count is staggering. I remember feeling like I had taken out an entire army by the time a single level was over. The downside was that it could get repetitive, and the difficulty was steep. Blood Bros. Now, let's fast forward to 1990 for a game called Blood Bros, made by TAD Corporation. If you've ever played Cabal, then you'll immediately recognise the style here, because Blood Bros is basically Cabal's spiritual sequel, just bigger, louder, and bloodier. The setup is a little more tongue-in-cheek than the other games on this list. You play as a cowboy and his Native American partner, blasting away at outlaws, bandits, and all sorts of enemies across a Wild West backdrop. The screen doesn't scroll like a normal shooter. Instead, your characters stay at the bottom while the background fills up with enemies, buildings, and destructible scenery. It almost feels like a shooting gallery, but with way more chaos. The violence comes from both the sheer destruction and the way enemies crumple when you shoot them. It's not the deepest game in the world, and I'll admit that after a few rounds, you start to feel the repetition. But there's something really satisfying about the carnage. For fans of arcade shooters, Blood Bros is an underrated entry that deserves way more love. Aliens. When I think about arcade games that took horror movies and slammed them into high-speed shooting mayhem, Aliens from 1990 by Konami is one I keep going back to. I remember first seeing this game in an arcade flyer. It promises xenomorphs, flamethrowers, power loaders, that brooding atmosphere from the movie, and it delivers. I often feel like people forget how well it translates the action horror of Aliens into arcade form. In Aliens, you can choose to play as Ellen Ripley or Corporal Hicks. Co-op works too. Start with a smart gun and then pick up other weapons. Flamethrowers, missile launchers, grenades. The enemy designs span from facehuggers and drones to weird hybrids designed just for the game. I like that there are segments that break from standard side-scrolling. Sometimes you're in a ventilation shaft, crouching. Sometimes enemies come from the background. Sometimes you're even riding in an APC. The final boss fight with the Alien Queen, including a power loader exoskeleton, is memorable, not just for the spectacle, but because of how it changes the feel of combat. It's brutally violent and you can feel the terror in the visuals. But there are drawbacks. It's punishingly difficult sometimes. Hit detection isn't always fair. Sometimes the pacing dips when the game wants you to explore areas rather than fight. Also, it never got a proper console port. People always ask why. So accessibility is limited. Audience reaction is mixed, but leaning positive. Critics at the time praised how gory and well-crafted it is. Some writers say Aliens is among the goriest coin-ops since Splatterhouse. Space Gun. Space Gun is one I only got to try through emulation, and every time I did I thought, arcade horror with laser guns? Yes please. Taito released it in 1990 and it's one of the more visceral light gun shooters of its time. The setting is aboard a failing space station overrun with aliens, and the missions are always part rescue, part massacre. For me, what sticks is how the game balances tension and action. There are horror elements, dark corridors, creepy lighting, the threat of aliens jumping out. But there's also the satisfaction of blasting through waves with a light gun, seeing blood splatters, seeing parts fall. The home ports, Amiga, Atari ST, etc., lose some of the arcade impact, but still carry over the core excitement. The downside is that light gun mechanics aren't always consistent. In arcades, I imagine calibration was better. At home, less so. Sometimes the horror is more implied than shown, to avoid censorship. Also, the story isn't deep. It doesn't try to do more than, you are on space station, aliens everywhere, don't die. But honestly, in this context, that's okay. Among fans of classic horror shooters, Space Gun is underrated. People remember Doom or Resident Evil, but few bring up Space Gun when talking about early alien horror. I think it deserves more credit for its brutal visuals and for pushing what a light gun game could do when paired with horror aesthetics.
Lethal Enforcers.
Lethal Enforcers. I'm always torn about Lethal Enforcers, 1992, because it isn't as overtly gore splatter as some others on this list, but it gets very violent in its own way, and it pushed boundaries in realism for its time. Konami delivered a light gun arcade experience where you play as a law enforcement officer cleaning up crime scenes, criminals, drive-bys, hostage situations. It's all here. The danger isn't just the enemies. Sometimes civilians or bystanders are nearby, and making a mistake means you pay, morally or in score. What really caught me about this game was how it made gunfire feel weighty. The environments are made to look like real-world streets, alleys, subways. While you don't see the same kind of splattery limb removals that Space Gun or Aliens show, I could feel the stakes. It was controversial at its release for being too realistic in depicting police violence. On the flip side, sometimes the scenarios feel a bit staged, because they are. The realism is tempered by arcade design, neat levels, scripted events. It doesn't offer much narrative depth beyond bad guys bad. Shoot them. Some people criticize that the replay value is limited once you memorize where every criminal appears. Also, light gun games by nature depend on hardware quality. If your gun is loose or uncalibrated, the experience suffers. Audience response was big at the time. It was popular in arcades and many home ports followed, SNES, Genesis, etc., which expanded its reach. But in discussions of violent arcade classics, Lethal Enforcers often gets overshadowed by shooters or horror mashups. Total Carnage. When I want arcade mayhem pumped up to 11, Total Carnage hits that sweet spot. Released in 1992, it amplifies everything from its predecessor, Smash TV, and the side-styled shooters, huge enemies, massive explosions, and a worldview where enemies explode so many times you stop counting. What I love is that the violence feels celebratory. I'm not ashamed of shooting demonic soldiers, mutants, bosses the size of buildings. This game wants you to feel godlike and destructive. One of the most memorable things is how Total Carnage handles scale. The colour palette stays bright, the sprites are big, you see guts, you see limbs fly, and you hear screams. It's arcade as catharsis. However, it too has flaws. Difficulty spikes are real. 1 minute, I'm cruising through hordes. Next, I'm overwhelmed by waves of enemies I didn't even see coming. Also, screen clutter sometimes hurts more than helps. Projectiles, enemies, explosions all over the place can make you lose track of what's going on. The level design, while visually interesting, sometimes sacrifices clarity for chaos. Fans love it though. It has co-op, which makes the destruction more fun and less lonely. It may not have the dark horror of Chiller or Space Gun, but as an exercise in ultra-violent destruction, it delivers.
Under Fire.
Under Fire. By 1994, violent arcade games had evolved, and Under Fire is one of those titles that walks that line between cinematic crime drama and shoot 'em up. I like Under Fire because it leans into real-world tension, hostage situations, bank robberies, car chases, criminals fleeing. I feel like with this one, violence isn't about fantasy monsters. It's about bad humans and the chaos they cause. The game is built to make you react carefully, shoot the right targets, spare civilians, reload, don't get caught in crossfire. It uses digitized graphics in many versions, which makes the setting feel more grounded. Yet, as with many light gun or rail shooters of this sort, the mechanics sometimes feel constrained. You're on rails, you rely on pickups and power-ups, and sometimes the scenarios repeat tropes: robbery, hostage, getaway. Critics of Under Fire at the time noted that while the digitization was impressive, it also aged poorly. Visuals become grainy, color fidelity drops, animations less smooth. Also, because it aims for semi-realism, some of the action feels less over the top. If I'm in the mood for pure, ridiculous gore, Under Fire doesn't hit quite as hard. But if I want tension, grit, and a violent game that makes me think a bit about how I shoot and whom I shoot, Under Fire delivers. Zombie Raid. When I slide the coin into Zombie Raid 1995, I always brace myself for camp, gore and mutant horror turned up to 10. I remember being struck by how the designers seemed to lean into the grotesque, not just for shock, but for spectacle. Heads explode, bodies are mangled, zombies ooze, and atmosphere matters. Lighting, monster sound design, and surprises, jump scares or monsters bursting out, are part of the horror. Mechanically, Zombie Raid has that old rail shooter or horror shooter feel. Limited movement, but enough choices in where to shoot, when to reload, and how to manage ammo and special weapons. What hurts it is how dated the graphics are now. Some sprites are jagged, animations clunky, and what once felt horrifying now edges toward retro cheesy. Also, difficulty can swing wildly. Some sections feel balanced, others make me feel like I'm gunned down unfairly. But the positives outweigh the negatives for me, because the game knows what it wants. People who love retro horror shooters often cite Zombie Raid as a guilty pleasure. Not perfect, but full of character. Carnival. Out of all the arcade games I've revisited, Carnival always stands out for mixing silliness and horror in a way that stays in your memory. Released in 1998, it leans into carnival and freak show grotesqueness more than pure terror. What I love is how Carnival doesn't try to hide its absurdity. When I shoot a giant clown, then shoot its clown car, then dodge possessed carnival music playing over the speakers, it feels like a horror carnival ride gone horribly right. The graphics are detailed, animations playful, sound effects jumpy. There's humour in the terror. That makes it different from games that just try to shock. Carnival wants me to grin while I recoil. Its weaknesses show up when I compare it with games that had tighter mechanics. Sometimes aiming with the light gun feels less precise. Some levels are short. Sometimes the novelty, zombie clown, scary doll, carnival ride, overshadows coherent pacing or challenge. Also, by 1998, arcades were waning in many places, so Carnival's audience was smaller than earlier games. But among fans of arcade horror and shooters, Carnival is rightly a cult classic. It's one of the more creative entries, blending horror, humour, gore and carnival aesthetics in a way few others did. Target Terror. I admit Target Terror is one of the more controversial entries on this list, mainly because it deals with real-world themes of terrorism, hostage situations, and modern weaponry. It came out in 2004, much later than most others, and by then, arcade gaming was already shrinking in many places. But that's part of why it feels underrated. It's a late bloom, doing something more hard-edged and real than fantasy monsters. When I played it, I felt a mix of discomfort and adrenaline, because this game pushes you into morally murky situations. Violence in Target Terror isn't about zombies or aliens. It's about humans, about explosions, about bombs, about saving or losing innocence. The graphics are more modern than earlier arcade games. Gunplay feels more responsive. Scenes are more cinematic. But with that come ethical questions. Is it appropriate to gamify terror, even in a hyper-violent arcade format? Mechanically, the game is decent. I like the tension, especially when civilians are around. I liked that you're forced to think about shots, about collateral damage. But it's less polished than many earlier entries when it comes to replayability, variety of enemy types, or environmental design. Blood Warrior. Blood Warrior is one of those arcade titles I've hunted down because of rumours about its gruesomeness. When I finally saw it, I felt a dark satisfaction. This is not family-friendly fare. The game is a 3D fighting game, or quasi-3D, with grotesque characters, brutal finishing moves, often dismemberment, exaggerated muscles, twisted monsters, and an aesthetic leaning heavily toward body horror. When a fighter loses, it's not always clean. Blood, entrails, violence are front and centre. The problem is, info about Blood Warrior is patchy. It didn't get big home console ports, and it never got the same documented attention as Mortal Kombat or Street Fighter. Because of that, many people don't even know it existed. But among arcade horror fighting fans, it has mystique. Its strengths are its intensity, its character design, monsters that look like nightmares, and the visceral feeling when matches get close. Weaknesses include the fact that balancing is rough. Some movesets feel unfair or too slow. Animations can be inconsistent. Also, without wide home console reach, audience was limited. But overall, audience reviews tend to say that if you like brutal fighters, go try Blood Warrior. And if you expect polish, maybe lower your expectations. Shadow Force. With Shadow Force, I feel like I'm stepping into a stealthy action movie that forgot to turn down the violence. Released in 1992, it's not fantasy or horror gauntlet stuff. It's gritty, armed combat, military or paramilitary themes, enemies taking heavy damage, close quarters fights, big explosions. The style is less about monsters, more about bad actors, betrayal, dark missions. What I remember about Shadow Force is the tension built into its levels. Sometimes I'm sneaking or moving carefully, sometimes going full frontal. Enemies sometimes drop to a bullet, sometimes they need more. Environment matters. Cover matters. The visceral part isn't just blood, it's the sense of danger. If you screw up, you might have to redo a section, or lose because you mistimed a shot. Its strengths include good graphics for its time, sound design that emphasizes gunfire, music that adds weight, and setups that make me feel like there's more than just shooting. Strategy too, but the weaknesses stand out. High difficulty. Sometimes the pacing is uneven, slow stretches, then sudden spikes. Also, compared to exotic horror or fantasy settings, Shadow Force is more grounded, which occasionally means less spectacle. It never got the kind of cult fame of Metal Gear Solid or Sniper Elite, but among retro arcade combat buffs, I hear people mention Shadow Force as a hidden gem.
Awaken, my brave
Metamorphic Force. Metamorphic Force is one of those beat-em-ups I regret not playing more in my arcade-wandering teenage years. Released by Konami in 1993, it had this cool beast-morphing hook. 4 heroes who can transform into monstrous versions of themselves. A minotaur, werewolf, werepanther, werebear, to fight through waves of anthropomorphic enemies and beasts. It's violent, yes, but spectacularly so. Skeleton knights, ram men with scythes, demon warriors, all kinds of panic-inducing boss fights. Its weaknesses are mainly in balance and exposure. Some enemies are too spongy, damage scales weirdly. Some transformations feel less useful than others. Also, by 1993, many players were shifting toward home consoles or 3D, so Metamorphic Force was one of the last of its kind. It didn't have the marketing muscle behind it to become a household name. I've seen recent re-releases, the Arcade Archives, bring it back, and people under those tags often say they'd forgotten how good it is. To me, Metamorphic Force deserves credit not just for its violence, but for being one of the more ambitious side-scrollers in the beat-em-up genre. Arabian Fight. When I think of Arabian Fight, I think spectacle, big sprites, bright colours, a sense of exotic fantasy, but with danger everywhere. Sega released it in 1992, and although it doesn't hit grotesque horror levels, its violence is loud, intense, and sometimes brutal in its own style. Enemies often come in waves, bosses are massive, environment hazards hurt, and combat isn't forgiving. What drew me to Arabian Fight when I discovered it is its aesthetic ambition. The setting is a fantasy version of Arabia. The game uses large character models, way larger than many beat-em-ups of its time, which means I can see detail in attacks, blood, impacts. When someone is punched, when someone drops, when fire or blades are involved, it has weight, but the drawbacks include that the controls sometimes feel slippery. Hit detection is occasionally ambiguous. Sometimes the pacing is off. Also, because it's fantasy-stylized violence, some players dismiss it as just flashy, not really brutal. But I think that's wrong. It's brutal in its energy and scale. Burning Fight. I've always had a soft spot for Burning Fight. It reminds me of walking into an arcade, seeing 3 characters on screen and thinking, okay, this is going to be brutal punching and kicking against gangs, alleyways, neon, peril. Released by SNK in 1991, it's very much in the mould of final fight-style brawlers, but with that SNK flair, gritty backgrounds, weapons that feel dangerous, and bosses that hit hard. Of course, there are trade-offs. Compared to the more fantastical or horror-centric games, Burning Fight feels constrained by realism. Also, by 1991, many beat-em-ups existed, so comparisons were inevitable. Some players felt Burning Fight didn't innovate enough beyond its peers. Another issue: home ports and skill demands. If you aren't good, the game beats you down hard. Still, in audience reviews, Burning Fight shows up as beloved among beat-up fans. Many say they played it in arcades growing up, but once consoles took over, it got buried under bigger titles. Marvelous verdict, and there you have it. 20 brutally underrated, ultra-violent arcade games that pushed boundaries, shocked parents, and gave kids like us way too much adrenaline. Some were pure gore fests. Others were just bizarre experiments in violence and style. But all of them showed how fearless arcade developers once were. They weren't afraid to go weird, dark, or straight up insane. And that's why we still remember them today. So next time someone says arcades were all Pac-Man and Street Fighter, drop these titles on them and watch their jaw hit the floor. And until next time, smash the like button, subscribe to the channel if you enjoy the content, and goodbye.